thank you so much for the organizers for inviting me to Think and Gender at UCLA. The title of my paper is Devisualizing the Archive, Refusal as Queer Trans Commitment. In one of a series of microcraft essays for poets and writers, Cameron Awkward Rich states that he writes a poem for Transgender Day of Remembrance, or TDOR, every year, including the poem Anti-Elegy. For Awkward Rich, trans became an intimate possibility in reference to strangers' deaths. Yet while gesturing to how, quote, trans has always felt entangled with elegy for him, he refuses to name the trans woman at the center of the senseless litany. Evoking the ante of the poem's title in opposition to the trans as elegy relation he understands his own transness within, Awkward Rich calls attention to anti-trans violence without asking the dead to rise and claim the very violence done to them. This unsettling of the elegy drives the core motivations of both this project and the methodologies I employ to work in and through archives of violence, death, and memory. The overarching goal of this project, then, is to define a methodology I call devisualization, which refuses the reproduction of visualized violence by non-visually disrupting its circulation. I work through such theorizing via a micro-historical tracing of the Human Rights Campaign's annual reports, focusing on their 10 fragmented years of tracking anti-trans violence across the United States from 2013 to 2022, and their embedded obituaries, which place the images of now dead trans people alongside texts that draw more attention to their violent means of dying than who they were while alive. By working in the violent archives of such reports and forms of memorizing, I propose an alternative historiographical approach that acknowledges the painful past without attempting to fix it, sits in the absence of what we do not and cannot know without working to fill it, and remembers those now gone in ways that foreground their once liveliness, rather than their present death and continued afterlife. The Human Rights Campaign, or HRC, is the largest LGBTQ+ advocacy group in the United States, primarily focused on protecting and expanding LGBTQ+ rights and protections. As they note on their website, making history is what we do. Since 2013, the HRC has tracked violence against trans people across the country, culminating in annual reports of the number of trans people killed, who they were, and what actions can be taken to, quote, stop this epidemic of violence, unquote. In the 8 reports from 2015 to 2022 I have access to, the underreported and misreporting of anti-trans violence both delays the HRC's ability to verify cases and renders it impossible to ever truly know the extent of such violence. While the HRC admits that their means of reporting and verifying cases are incomplete methods of knowing just how extensive this epidemic really is, such limitations should not dissuade criticism of how the HRC disseminates such knowledge in their annual reports, including which fragmented pieces of information they choose to not only publish but amplify. That is, such archival limits can be generative grounds of critique that considers other methodologies. In their introduction to queer necropolitics, Jean Harita Warren, Adi Kunstman, and Sylvia Posecco frame the killability of trans people in the context of queer necropolitics, which, quote, is not limited to individual subjects and bodies, rather it engulfs whole populations co-signed to death, unquote, leading to the physically wearing out of trans communities through mundane regimes of abandonment and disopposability. Iran C. Azoura's own contribution frames a trans necropolitics that's precedented on the, quote, mobility of gender-variant bodies and the circus of capital they/we exploit and are exploited by, unquote, where the deadly incorporation of the labor of trans bodies means trans people are targeted by the state under the pretense of recognition. This extraction of necro value from trans people, especially trans people of color, once they have been killed or left to die, generates a queer and trans fatality, or the sense of vigor that sweeps over queer communities during TDOR and other memorializing services that is, quote, often cannibalistic on the lives and deaths of the very people it claims to represent, unquote. What would it mean then to refuse this excavation of a trans afterlife for the moral practices of the living? To let the dead rest rather than accumulate value for those who foster community and the expansion of LGBTQ+ nonprofits such as the HRC through the circulation of their names, images, and how they died. Turning to the obituaries in the HRC's annual reports, where the images of dead trans people are tied up with texts that explicitly and exploitatively detail their deaths and little else, how are we meant to read these images other than as a precursor to their subject's future extinguishment and circulation in a trans afterlife? One method of refusing the circulation of such death-imbued visual textual relations is devisualization, which unprivileges the image from its visual registers in favor of written and or re-narration that is itself deliberately incomplete. Methodologically, it has three main goals. It prioritizes describing the image rather than showing it. It necessitates sitting with incomplete archives and their absences, which leads to a slowing down of archival research and rumination over what is and is not made available. And it implicates the historian within the archive to ask how it can be worked in differently. Devisualization requires self-reflection. What do I choose to describe? How do I describe it? What responsibilities do I have to these materials and histories? What steps must I take to ensure I honor such images and their subjects without exhuming them in my own pursuit of historical knowledge or touching a queer/trans past? Devisualization does not require complete answers to such questions, but does ask the historian to sit with them and their possibilities. This methodology owes much to Eric A. Stanley's imperfect decisions to either re-narrate or refuse to reproduce scenes of police brutality, medical neglect, suicide, and other forms of anti-queer/trans violence in their book, Atmospheres of Violence. I follow their, quote, radical commitment to keeping each other alive and toward ending the world that produces this unfolding archive, unquote, to articulate not only the generativity of such archival absences, but the importance of staying with the harm of these painful materials without bringing them back with me. Devisualization is a commitment to queer/trans livability beyond the archives of mere death and violence. It is also a refusal to fold my reader into the same violences I am dwelling in. That is, it requires both a responsibility to the image and the reader who will never see it, yet must rely on the historian to divulge information to them. Tracking the HRC's annual reports and their obituaries, it soon became clear to me that often the text focuses more on describing the circumstances surrounding the death of each trans person rather than who they were in life. Some details of these obituaries are so gruesome, they read more like crime reports than obituaries meant to honor their lives. So when I speak of the violence of the archive with its various cut-in and call-it and extraction, I'm also speaking to the violences it contains and brings to the fore. Why such painful and violent knowledge-making rendered the legitimate means of understanding the conditions of being trans, and why does it organize not only trans life, but trans death in its afterlife? What consistently threads these 8 reports I have access to is the kind of images that supplement these texts. The vast majority of them are selfies, with very few taken by another person, frequently pixelated, which makes it harder to decipher any type of details. There's a shocking contrast between viewing images upon images of seemingly happy trans people next to descriptions of how violently they died, oftentimes collected under the banner of in memoriam. Are these really obituaries meant to commemorate the dead, or media and police inform reports under the pretense of memory? If we see the obituary in relation to the elegy's classic 3-part structure of lament, praise, and consolation, can we find any of these elements in the HRC's framing of the trans obituary? What if instead we describe them as their subjects presumably saw themselves? What if we sever the ties between images of smiling trans people and descriptions of their violent deaths by refusing to show their image as an act of relocation, to not make our first knowledge of them how they died, to use devisualization as a means of not only describing their images, but reimagining what their subsequent obituaries might say? So what follows are 2 brief and complete examples of what devisualization can look like. The italicized obituaries to the left are either excerpts or full obituaries from the HRC's reports, and to the right is my rewritings. So this is one example. So the left is the original and the right is my rewriting. And then I'm just going to talk over this. I describe the images without showing them to reframe their surrounding text. While in these reimagined obituaries, I choose to retain most of the language that is not directly about the violence inflicted on these Black trans women, I refuse to lead with explicit details of their deaths. Instead, I begin with descriptions of what I can gather from their images and then move differently in a speculative turn. I can never know for sure who these women were in life, nor how they felt while they took the selfies that would eventually be the images the living now connect to the dying. And here's another rewrite. But I imagine these trans women happy not in spite of these absences, but because such gaps offer the possibility of speculative conjuring, or what feminist historian Alison Nadia Field may call an aspirational process. I imagine them happy because what has and continues to be done to their images circulation is too painful to be sustainable for long-term queer and trans livability. None of my attempts at reimagining these obituaries or the terms of conditions of their violent archives will change the fact that these trans people died violent deaths and continue to die violent deaths in the United States. This part of the past cannot be cured, but it can be taken care of, to quote Heather Love, without attempting to fix it, which means living with bad attachments, identifying with loss, allowing ourselves to be haunted. Devisualization is both a methodological process and processing, a slippery and incomplete method that speaks to the slippery and incomplete archives it refuses capitulation with. There are no solid answers on how to best frame these obituaries, but there must be a commitment to an elsewhere, to ending the world that produces such archive and archivable violences. Ultimately, devisualization complicates encounters with the archive by imagining what it could look like otherwise, refusing extraction and circulation so that the silences it produces can occupy us. To never forget that there is continued violence against trans people while remembering that death is not the only term of our existence. Return to the elegy, Aubrey Rich considers the following. Poets and scholars have long debated the ethics of elegy, whether an elegy can ever provide the constellation of promises, whether and under what circumstances we ought to make use of the dead, whether mourning enables or precludes political action. The answer to each of these questions is, of course, it depends. I consider these questions with regard to the obituary. The ethics of its use, or whether devisualization is the right methodological approach, ultimately depends. Still, and I quote again, there's something to be said for a poetics of trans Black queer life that takes death as its impetus but not its object, that mourns but also, and because of this, hopes, unquote. Lend those who speak the space to do so, and those who do not the space necessary to fill the generative silences. Thank you.